Hello and welcome to a brand new programme. This is called the European Report. This is a programme that's recorded in the heart of the European Union here in the European Parliament in Brussels. And today's topic of discussion is the issue of anti-Semitism. And sadly, in recent years, we've seen an increase in anti-Semitism across the continent of Europe, that taking many forms. In particular, we've seen an increase in the movement to delegitimize the state of Israel, as we face that Israel faces incredible international hostility. So in this programme today, we'll be discussing these vital issues as we remember over 70 years ago the dark history of Europe in which over 6 million Jewish lives were murdered at the hands of the Nazis. And it's time that it's time that Christians stood together with the Jewish people to confront this evil known as anti-Semitism. Today I'm joined by Thomas Sandel, who is the director of the European Coalition for Israel, and Maurice Soorski, is a leader of the Belgian Jewish community and a professor and lecturer at the UBL University here in Brussels. And it's a great honour to have Bastiaan Belder, a Dutch member of the European Parliament, on the discussion programme today. Thomas, as director of ECI, the European Coalition for Israel, can you explain how the Lord really led you to get involved in the work of European politics that's led you here to the European Parliament?
Well, I think the short answer to that question is that in 2003 and 2004, we saw a significant rise in anti-Semitic crimes across Europe, to the extent that there was a survey which was carried out by the European Commission asking one simple question: which country do you think poses the biggest threat to world peace? And to everyone's embarrassment, the answer was Israel. So only one generation after Holocaust, the Europeans tend to think that all the problems in the world again was to be blamed on the Jewish people. At that point, the Commission very wisely put together an emergency summit where they brought together Jewish leaders, Christian leaders and others to try to address this question. And Elie Wiesel spoke at that event, and he said, well, still today in 2004, I see what I saw in the 30s and the 40s. The only people who are really reacting against anti-Semitism still are the leaders from the Jewish community. And he was asking, where are all the others? And I think at that moment we felt as Christians to really bring together a coalition of all the others to speak up and to speak against this new form of virus of anti-Semitism which was again spreading in Europe.
And Maurice, you are here representing the Jewish community here in Brussels. Can you tell us what it's like being Jewish and growing up in post-World War II Belgium and Europe?
But first of all, I have to thank Belgium because my parents came after the war. My father lost his wife in the concentration camps. He came out of Auschwitz. My mother lost her husband, so they married in Belgium, and the life was very nice. First, they were accepted, they were assimilated in Belgium, because for the Jewish people, as you know, the law of the country is the law, and this is of major importance. If you see today the problems that we meet everywhere in Europe. So for me, these was the good old days because I grew up in a very nice environment. I never had any I don't remember any anti-Semitic events that I had to in school, in primary school, even during the university. It starts at the end of university, of course, because of Israel, of Kippur's War and so on, and that start. But there was no major events that I remember against Jewish people all during this period.
And what's the situation like now?
Well, unfortunately, the situation's changed a lot. The recent year, you see mixing the extreme left-wing people with extreme Muslims, this mixing is very frightening for everyone, and it changed completely. You know what's interesting and very frightening for me is that I spoke about my young year when I was at the primary school, for example. There were one Jewish school at that time, a very religious school, and that only a few people would go to that school. Today, the young generations and the young parents are afraid to send their children in the public school, and you have today three major, I speak in Brussels, I don't speak even for Antwerp, but in Brussels, three major Jewish schools, and they cannot accept any more children because they feel the fears in the public school and they want to send them in the Jewish school, which is a bad climate. I won't support this kind of things because I grew up in this public school, but there are so many anti-Semitic events that the parents are afraid and they send them to the Jewish school.
And Bastian, it's a great honour to have a member of the European Parliament here joining us today. Can you tell us about how you got involved in politics and what led you to become a member of the European Parliament?
Firstly, I had no ambition at all to be a politician. No, I'm an historian, and I was for 15 years a lecturer in history in Rotterdam, near my village of birth, and it was a pleasure that I worked together with young students, and then I had the opportunity to become involved in journalism. I was for 15 years then a journalist. For my main study was East European history at the University of Utrecht, and so of course Jewish affairs was very near to my heart. For that I should not forget that I'm a Protestant, I'm a Calvinist. I grew up in a family that had a strong belief, my both parents and also my brothers, who is also one is theologian, that we left the Old Testament and as much as the New Testament because it was quite obvious for us that God had chosen His own people, Israel. And to come back as a journalist, I also had become more and more involved in the Middle East. And my party, Calvinist Party, the oldest party of the Netherlands, SGP, asked me in the summer of 1998 if I wanted to be candidate for the European Parliament. I was elected, and I'm now elected already for the third time. I want to serve the Lord of Israel, so I want also to serve His chosen people. If it be in Israel, the small state, your state, or if it be in the diaspora. So what is happening towards the Jewish people in Europe, I think that is a very important task. You spoke about anti-Semitism. We should look inside Europe but also outside. For what is now, especially as I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, what is now especially a thing that should be hammered out here in the Parliament, that good relations with the Arab world, okay, nothing against, but let us look at the upsurge of anti-Semitism at the moment together with the Arab Spring. That is very, very disappointing, more than disappointing. It is, I think it is very dangerous, for it means that Jewish people in the diaspora are not safe, but also the Jewish state is not safe. And that is especially, here we are in the continent of the Holocaust. So we should not underestimate this very great danger towards our Jewish fellow citizens. I was born, by the way, in 1946, so after the war, but I was raised in my home by my parents what happened. And I still remembered the faces of the boys and the girls of my age when I was looking at the pictures and in the photo books. And we cannot know enough, and we cannot do enough to internalize it, what happened. For example, I was shocked some days ago, Arno Lustinger passed away And he was not an historian by profession, but was an excellent historian because he showed that there was a Jewish resistance. The Jews were not like cheap, the resistance, Jews and non-Jews, yes. and of ordinary people. And the stories he delved from the archives are words, remembering, and also words to be spread among our colleagues here in the Parliament. It is a lesson that should be told again and again, because, as you said in your introduction, to put in one word, there is a very marvelous school in the middle of Amsterdam, Geyde School. And that school looks like a military barrack because of safety concerns of the children. I have grandchildren. Some decades after the war, our Jewish co-citizens are still not safe. That is so shameful. We should do away with this shame.
Thomas,
if I just can add something, you know, what you just said now, for me, it's so disgusting to have a Jewish school surrounded by police guards, military. We have the only, or any kind of Jewish event is surrounded by these kind of guards. So that means that the Jewish children are like in a ghetto, you know. And I mean, why? Just asking why. I mean, it's nobody else. So you have to educate people, children, in these feelings of fear because you are Jew. And this is something that is completely disgusting, and I cannot accept.
Thomas, it's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? We're here in the European Parliament. There's a real weight of history upon our shoulders here that Europe needs to do more to counter this disease of anti-Semitism, which we thought was eradicated at the end of World War II through the liberation of Auschwitz and the other concentration camps. But to understand the issue we're tackling, we need to understand what anti-Semitism is. But what's your definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, you know, this is a question that has been debated and discussed in even more prominent forums than ours here today. And I think each time people try to define it, they face the same challenges. It's impossible to understand, rationally speaking. Anti-Semitism, I think I prefer to say simply Jew hatred, a very irrational Jew hatred, which I cannot explain it in any rational way, in any ideological forms. I remember I took part in a panel in this European Parliament a few years ago, and there was a long discussion going back 100 years in time in Europe and saying, well, maybe this is the explanation. It had to do about, you know, the far right, the far left. But when I had the chance to speak in the panel, I said, listen, I'm probably the only Gentile here, but I want to remind you about the book in your holy book, the Book of Esther, which was not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago, but several thousand years ago. The same irrational hatred of the Jewish people, wanting to eliminate a whole race. For me, I could speak either as a, you know, trying to be a scientist and say that this is a virus which is mutating and coming up in new forms in every generation. I think as a Christian, I would say there has got to be something very demonic with this reoccurrence of this hatred, which goes way back to you know, 1,000 years back in history and is still as current in European society. So I think if you want to take a spiritual perspective on it, you may say that if we understand the Lord correctly, that he wanted to bring redemption through a particular people, to be a light to the nations. Of course, if we believe in an enemy to that plan, the enemy would want to shut out that light as fervently as possible. But nevertheless, I mean, it doesn't really bring much to the table if we can define the disease. I think what we need to look at is, of course, how we can combat the disease.
Absolutely.
And when I may refer to what you said just about that is abnormal, this situation of our co-citizens from Jewish origins. I was, in the beginning of May, I was with the delegation, as chair of the Israel delegation, I was in the Knesset, and a lady from the foreign ministry told us about that we should battle in Europe against the denormalization of Israel, of the Jewish state in the region, in the Middle East. When we are speaking about, we should be aware that we are also, how normal at the moment is the situation, are the lives of Jewish citizens of European member states. Speaking about denormalization, that is so we see the assault from two sides. And I think when you speak about why this deep hatred of the Jews, why it's so irrational. And I studied, for example, the really irresponsible and irrational tales about the Jews in Iranian literature, the Holocaust denial, for example, that even it is said that Hitler has a Jewish mother and such really silly things. I'm convinced that by attacking the Jews, you are attacking the Lord of the Jews. And that gives me also the consolation, the deep consolation that the Lord has his means to protect his own people, his own chosen people. And I see it as my task that as a Christian believer, that I should, as much as possible, as the Lord gives me talents, I should try to protect them as is possible. But I must say, let alone in these dark years of the Holocaust. So when I read about, it was a German prostitute in the middle of the war in Berlin that hit Jews at night, and she died in poorness, and she was forgotten. Alone Arno Lustinger told about her, so there were righteous people. And I think so the Lord will always send people, and it is our great responsibility in the Parliament. What we have a responsibility towards the Jewish people on the continent.
And Maurice, I've had a pleasure and a privilege of meeting so many different Jewish leaders here in Belgium. They all come out with the same message. And that message is one of fear, one of anxiety, with many of them talking about making Aliyah to Israel or to emigrate to the United States. What is the current situation facing the Jewish community here in Brussels in terms of anti-Semitism?
Well, it's like I said, it's just frightening for the moment. A recent European report shows that in countries like Hungary, Poland, 70% of the citizens would agree with sentencing that the Jewish people are taking advantage from the Holocaust, or that they have too much power in the media, in the business, which are the characteristic of anti-Semitism, from myself, anti-Jewish feelings. 70% of Hungary people or Poland, more than 50 in Spain, and it seems 25% in France and Belgium. But I mean, can you imagine that those kind of sentiments appears again? And what is really frightening is the free speech today. Today, anyone can say such kind of things on the media, maybe on blogs, you know, on the internet, and you have such violent words that appears that you become really afraid what can happen. There are a lot of anti-Semitism act. We record roughly 65 anti-Semitic acts every year in Belgium. Violent act, I mean, you can hit a Jewish guy because he's wearing a kippah, or because of words, slogan written on those kind of. Each time something happened in Israel, of course, this number rise. What is really frightening is after the murder in Toulouse, this number rises again. In 2 months following this murder, we record as much as anti-Semitic event that during the whole last year, in 2 months. That means this murder is a hero for people. For some people, he becomes a hero. And I mean, I speak about free speech, now it's free act. From the speech to the murder, there is probably a very very light frontier. And this is probably what the Jewish people feels today.
And Bastian,
may I come back for that? I remembered when I carefully listened to you. When I entered here the European Parliament in 1999, I got my first report on the Foreign Affairs Committee already within 2 months. And then imagine we were in front of the enlargement process. So the just liberated countries of the former Eastern Bloc were coming to us, and I had to write a report on combating racism, xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And I vividly remembered, I had then, there was an expert on Central and Eastern Europe, Michael Shafir. He especially was an expert on Romania. And I sent him a mail about what he was thinking about combating anti-Semitism in the accession countries. And I never forgot his right answer, that he said, look, there are groups in the old Europe, Western Europe, that are given the wrong signals and the wrong messages to hate groups that hate the Jews. So it's coming from the west to the east to fuel anti-Semitism. That was for me a lesson. So we were here we were looking how can we prevent racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and he told the lesson, look at yourself, for you are fueling it, you are stimulating it. And now we are in 2012 and you spoke about it. We should take our lessons.
And Thomas, here we are in the European Parliament, and we have to understand that the European Union was formed and birthed out of the horrors of World War II as a means for European nations to come together so there wouldn't be any more wars, there wouldn't be any more conflicts. And yet we're seeing in our day a huge rise of anti-Semitism again on the continent of Europe. Why do you believe this is now taking root in Europe?
Well, I think in a way you can answer the question and say that anti-Semitism has always been a reality in Europe. I think the rare periods in history where there has been little anti-Semitism are actually rare periods. And you can take, for example, say after the war, the Second World War, there was, say, 30 years, 40 years, a period with relatively little anti-Semitism for obvious reasons. I think what we are seeing today is, sadly so, more of a reflection of what has been the reality in Europe, regardless of if it's the 15th century, the 16th century, the 19th century going into the 20th century. This is nothing new. And that's why I say it's important to look beyond the last 100 years, even to look beyond the Holocaust. Why is it coming up so strongly today? I think, nevertheless, having said what I just said, I think there are a few elements which are partly can explain the equation. One is, of course, that we had an influx of Muslims, some of them radical Muslims, subscribing to Islamism, where hatred of the Jewish people sadly is a component. I want to mention this very clearly to say this is not the only explanation. I believe just as relevant as I think Maurice pointed out in Hungary is you have a neo-fascism, extreme right-wing movements which are growing stronger, particularly because of the financial crisis. You then have the extreme left, but fourthly, and I think this is so important for us to point out, there is also in Christian circles an ignorance, but also a growing feeling of anti-Israelism. And I think many good Christians would tend to think that as long as they are against the Jewish state, they're not really anti-Semites. But if you look at the language and the expressions of this new type of anti-Semitism, that I would call it, it's just as bad as ever in the 1930s and the 40s. So having pointed out a number of reasons, I think as a Christian believer, you have to start with yourself. You have to clean up before your own door and also make it clear to say that the Holocaust did not happen because of Islam. It happened because it happened in a Christian continent, in a civilization which per definition was Christian. So we need to start with ourselves, but at the same time realizing that there are other forms of evil out there.
And Maurice, as we look on the new form of anti-Semitism, which is essentially now anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment that's surrounding the Arab-Israeli conflict, that when we see a conflict going off in Israel, whether Israel's confronting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon or confronting Hamas in Gaza and military confrontation, then we see an escalation in attacks against the Jewish community in Britain and across Europe. Can you explain this new form of anti-Semitism that's really attacking the Jewish state of Israel?
It's just what I said before, when there were 3 years ago the Gaza war, we had a raise, anti-Semitism act, very important raise in Brussels and everywhere else in Europe, of course. The problem is that, again, what I said is nobody stopped the free speech at that time, because from attacking Israel, I don't speak about politics here. I can understand that some people do not appreciate it, the war that Israel could lead at that time. Nevertheless, between attacking Israel and saying that all the Jews are murdered and they have to exterminate the Jewish people again, I mean, this is, I couldn't accept this, although also the fact that the politicians here in Belgium and in Europe allowed this kind of speech. They didn't say, oh, this time you can attack Israel, but you cannot attack the Jewish people because they are Jews. Nobody would do such kind of move. And I was really frightened by the fact that there were no in Brussels, there was a huge manifestations against Israel, and this with a lot of politicians. No one went out of the meeting saying we cannot stand with slogan saying the Jewish are murderers and we have to kill them. We decided. You can understand that it's amazing for the Jewish people, because we are citizens of a country, to be polarized like this. And this kind of fears, I heard people saying to me, you know, I feel Brussels like I was in Berlin in the years of 30s, because there is no limit anymore. And again, I do believe that the words are killers, and the words today are very badly used. And nobody stopped this kind of speech.
Yeah, I just wanted to say very briefly that you have the case of Malmö, the city of Malmö in the south of Sweden, with many radical expressions of anti-Semitism. But the saddest part of that story is that the mayor would say exactly what you just said. he would say publicly that, well, of course you have to understand our population, they are very upset. And I am personally upset what I see the Israelis doing in the so-called occupied territories. So he is legitimizing the hatred, which is completely irrational. And I think this is a real problem to be dealt with. Second thing is also to say that this is built on the notion that we are importing the conflict from the Middle East to Europe. But if that was so, you would also then see Jewish community attacking Muslim communities. To my knowledge, that has never happened. So there's nothing symmetrical in that notion of saying we are just importing a conflict into Europe. It's just again a scapegoat to say, well, any reason I will find to attack and discredit the Jewish people in Europe, I will use those arguments.
What for me is important, you can understand, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and as a chair of the Israel delegation, several years ago I was really shocked by a very well-researched analysis of Rifat Bari. He's a well-known Turkish Jewish intellectual and historian. And I saw it from that time several years ago. He wrote a piece for the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. So you can see it. And I'm now in touch with him and I spoke on this issue. Turkey is a candidate member. We have every year we have reports from the European Commission and reports also from the Parliament. Already 2 times in vain I tried to have an amendment accepted by the Parliament that the European institutions, the Council, the Commission and the Parliament should say to Erdogan and the like, AKP government, that they should really stop with fueling and producing anti-Semitism in Turkey. For Erdogan is denying it. Islam is not compatible with anti-Semitism. It is of course ridiculous in historical terms and also in actual terms. But what is happening here? We are negotiating with a country that about membership that does not even recognize its own anti-Semitism. That's a very bad example of a political, I think not ignorance, no, there is no really will to address this issue. Of course, when you look at the reports of the European Commission, that there are anti-Semitic utterances in the media, but it is worse. So, I see it as my task as chair of the Israel delegation that we should address it again and again till it is accepted and that is internalize it here. So it is not, when you speak, the majority, I think the majority of the colleagues are unaware or don't like to, when you speak about the Arab Spring and the rise of anti-Semitism, it is quite obvious. Look what's happening in Syria. It is so depressing. The regime is saying that the opposition, the Free Syrian Army, are the donkeys of Mossad against the Jews, and the opposition is saying all the bloodshed that is because the Jews want the blood of Muslims for the masses. And when you say that, they are looking at you, and we should really, it is, I think, but you spoke about the roots. I'm also convinced that is a very poisonous fruit of the secularization of Europe, surely also in my country. And also, of course, of Islamic immigrants and especially radical Muslim immigrants. And then I come back to you. What is really astonishing, but I can explain it historically as an historian, of course, that what we see here in the Parliament is that the extreme left, Gouet, for example, what they are saying about Iran, Gouet, and anti-Semitic Muslims, they are forming a coalition.
But I'd like to add to what you said, even in Europe, in the European community. 2 years ago, I had a remark from De Gucht, who is commissary.
Yeah.
You remember De Gucht, a Belgian commissary?
Yeah, trade commissioner.
Who could say, as a European commissioner, that you cannot speak with Jewish people about Israel because they are irrational. I mean, this was said as one of the major anti-Semitic sentences that have been said during the 2010. He didn't give any explanation, he didn't want to excuse himself, whatever. I mean, he has to show an example and just give anti-Semitic sentence. So we are in the European Parliament and he could say such kind of sentence. I mean, it's amazing. The other thing...
We wrote to him a letter. We wrote to him a letter.
Yeah. He didn't change his mind. Huh? So I have a major problem with this. Because when I speak about free speech, this is what gives reason to have anti-Semitic event. You know, he gives support. You don't know if it's because he knows that he's been supported by people that think like him, which unfortunately I believe, or the opposite.
And Bastian, sorry, I just really want to pick up on your point, because I think you raised a very, very important point as a historian and as a Christian member of the European Parliament, that here we are, we've just seen recently in the last couple of years the European Constitution, or known as the Lisbon Treaty, being implemented, in which God is not even part of the European Constitution. It's run by a very militant secularist agenda, as we're seeing legislation out of Europe that's affecting Britain, it's affecting European countries, that's affecting Christians throughout Europe. Isn't one of the greatest dangers in confronting this new rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is that as we're seeing the Middle East, we're seeing the rise of Islamic extremism with the Arab Spring in the Arab world, we're seeing the rise of militant Islam across the world. And yet here in Europe, because we've thrown away our anchorage, which is our Judean Christian heritage, we don't have any values left to be able to fight this new form of a disease, which is anti-Semitism, this new militant secularism. How can we rally Christians in support of Israel and the Jewish people to confront anti-Semitism and preserve our Judean Christian values that have been the anchorage of our societies throughout Europe for centuries?
We should be honest. Also in my church, the main Protestant church of the Netherlands, there are also people that are very critical about Israel, are pro-Palestinian, and that is the beginning often. That is the beginning often because of what I have seen of during my visit of delegation, also here, that it is, you can have a debate and opposite viewpoints of policy. But that it doesn't stop with Israel. That doesn't stop. Anti-Zionism is, it is from the Soviet times, it was a guise for anti-Semitism and nothing else. Mm-hmm. So what is important for me, and we should, it is in the Bible, we should start with our own house. And that means for me, as a Dutch citizen, as a churchgoer, I should be aware what is going in my churches. Do I learn in the preachings, in the sermons, do I hear a love for the Jewish people, for Israel? Is there a prayer? That's important. There is still a prayer, but we should be aware. For it is, we are in a secular society at the moment, and the wine is going very chilly. But that said, we are here in the Parliament. We have also the European Friends of Israel. And I feel at the moment, especially last week, I saw that also from the Socialist Party, there are also members, and also from the Greens, that stand up and say it is enough. And that's a really smell that is going in the totally wrong direction. So we should do our best to make friends and to have really good arguments. And I think that is the best argument is you. It cannot be tolerated what you are saying, that what you are experiencing as a full member, a full civil member of the Belgian society, and also in so it's good that we speak about this issue. For it should be really high on the European agenda. For otherwise, there is a very threatening silence.
Thomas, you've recently been to the United Nations and really representing Israel's case to the UN. What is the experience and the attitudes you're feeling within the United Nations that now this form of anti-Semitism, the racially profiling the Jews, now transferred onto the international scene, on the international community, and now it's the Jewish nation that is victimized and discriminated against in the realms of international diplomacy?
Yeah, I think what we experience in Brussels, we see at an even greater extent in New York, at the United Nations, and Geneva for that matter. And I think someone said it very, very well, that, you know, in the past it was the Jew, now it's the Jew of the nation, the Jewish state. So the anti-Semitic stereotypes which were applicable at the time in these stereotypes to a people group is now being transferred to a modern state. And we are trying to combat these stereotypes, which has a lot to do also with the delegitimization of Israel as a state, the whole notion. I even heard, and I won't mention the nationality, but the deputy ambassador to the United Nations who made a quote last week in New York. He said, well, are the Jewish people really a people? So this was a very prominent representative to the UN, and we've just been going through the whole legal case for the modern state of Israel. And he said, well, wait a minute, has it really been constituted that the Jewish people are a people? So once you have that level of ignorance on the highest political level, you can just imagine what you get once you get lower down in the strata. And this, I could say, it's a European, one of the largest European member states. But in the UN, of course, you have a majority of nation states which do not subscribe to democracy, do not subscribe to human rights, do not subscribe to parliamentarism. And so, of course, it should not come as a surprise that anything having to do with the Jewish state is something seen as something very negative. But of course, my main concern, though we are increasingly active also at the United Nations, is of course to cover our own backyard, Europe. And I think in a forum like the United Nations, I think the European nations still carry a certain weight, that people expect more of the European nations. They have a higher standard of expectancy. And that's why I believe it's so important that if we fail here on the streets of Brussels, if we fail here in the Parliament, the European Parliament of the European Union, we will really weaken the pillars of our civilization and as you said, our Judeo-Christian heritage. And that's why I believe if we are to focus and concentrate anywhere, it has to be where the battleground always have been, historically. Not only the 6 million who died and perished at the Holocaust, but the 6 million who died before Holocaust. So again, as a European, I have no reason to be proud. There are things I can be proud of, but there are also things that have been done on European soil that we have to be very shameful of, and we have to learn from those mistakes, and we have to be different today as Gentiles, as non-Jews, as Christians. We have to be different from our forefathers in the 30s and the 40s. And that is what the European coalition is all about. You know, being here, raising the flag in time, having these type of programs, speaking one-on-one with members of this parliament, and supporting friends like Bastian Belder, who is such a strong pillar of support for the Jewish state here in Brussels.
I just want to open this up to the floor, really. How much do you think that media reporting has a part to play in creating a false impression of what's happening in the Middle East? And does that have a direct impact not only on public opinion across Europe that's turning against Israel, but also amongst the European elites, such as the European Commission and members of the European Parliament?
As a former journalist, I'm very critical about the coverage of Israel in the Western press. But there are some lights. Some years ago already, so it should be repeated, there was a marvelous piece in the Süddeutsche Zeitung about Wirtschaftswunder, the Israeli economic miracle. And I think indeed, and that is also the task of my delegation, together with the Israeli embassy, we are working to let them see that the Jewish people are a people of a lot of miracles. A lot of miracles, and the Jewish state is the expression of a lot of miracles. And we can show it. And it is not only for them, it is also for the European, also for Europe. We should recognize it. in astonishment to the grace of the Lord, I must say, as a Christian. But that is the issue, and so it is very unbalanced, and therefore it is dangerous, for it is fueling against that Israel. Look, it is still the only state of law in the Middle East. Still, and what are the Israeli politicians saying to me? We are longing for and we're looking for an Arab world that is as democratic as the Jewish state is. And normalization, and there's still not normalization, and Europe should be aware, especially now with the neighborhood policy, that we should set strong conditions. We want peace in the Middle East, we want stability. Look, we are provoking destability. And there should be a good order of things in European politics, and that is I think very important. I hope that the delegation for Israel will do its best and will work in that direction.
If I can add something first about the media, we are suffering from the report of the media, what's happening in Israel, because they don't react very well, they don't describe the fact as they happened. So I spent some time with journalists. Journalists, they were against Israel a year ago, and just showing, because as an amateur, not professional, not linked to the Israeli embassy, just showing what's happening really in Israel, why.
As a scholar.
Yeah, just a scholar. I mean, you know, we spend times in the Weizmann Institute showing signs, but also speaking in Jerusalem to Arabic people, saying, you will choose for splitting in Jerusalem? They would say no, because we like the security system in Israel, and we won't have this kind of protections in the country. So this is the problem, that nobody would speak about the good things that Israel does, always the bad things, and they will strongly speak about those facts. So we are really suffering from the reports. But what I would like to say about the value, you spoke about the value of the religions, of the Bible. I would speak about the value of ethics. And you know that I'm particularly touched today by a group that's called BDS. Boycott, disinvestments, sanctions against Israel. So as an academic, I feel very bad, because in my university, which is Université Libre de Bruxelles, we are secular, but we are the only university in Europe that have accepted this group with their goal. The only goal is to destroy Israel. When you accept a circle, they have to get a positive goal. This group is just a negative group. You won't have a group that would speak against China because they occupied Tibet. You won't have a group that would speak loudly against what's happening in Syria, just against Israel. And this group now is infiltrating
Turkey with the Kurds.
Kurds, exactly. Whatever. It's always against Israel. And then probably it comes from all the things that people read or hear in the media. And so they accept, because of the free expressions, tolerance. Because of the tolerance we have to the free expressions, we accept intolerant people in our society. We cannot speak with those guys anymore. They don't accept. I'm a criminal because I support Israel. You know, as an academic, I can't have the words. They won't invite me anymore because I'm not a Jew. I'm just a Zionist, which is the worst insult you can give. Today, you are a Zionist in my university. That's the way they believe, and so we can't have a word on this. This is the situations today in the major university in Brussels. which is the, and I just want to finish with about my definitions about anti-Semitism. You know, as a doctor, as an MD, I compare it to a virus. This virus mutates from generations. You know, the resistance of virus, the virus of flu exists because it mutates every year. It's the same for anti-Semitism. It was first the problem of the Christian because the Jewish were the murder of Jesus Christ. Then during the 17th, 18th century, because of the Enlightenment, we were responsible of this, and of course we were, because this was open-minded people. Then afterward, it was because became a racist view because of Hitler and the Nazis period. Today, the virus mutate to negationism and to anti-Zionism. It's so easy to become anti-Semitic because of what Israel does. So again, this virus mutated, and today we are strongly facing the new anti-Semitism, which is negationism, like Dieudonné, you know, the French humorist that always attacked the Jew and saying that Auschwitz, it's a lie. And the second thing is Israel, which is the worst thing that happens.
I think we're down to the last 6 minutes of this programme, really, and I think the focus now, we've looked at how depressing the situation is across Europe. What are the solutions that the European Parliament can introduce to protect vulnerable Jewish communities from anti-Semitism, and how can we as Christians stand more together with the Jewish people and standing with Maurice against this violence that is represented in anti-Semitism? Thomas, maybe.
Well, thank you. Of course, I think it's my friend Bas who has the political solution, but I think from a civil society point of view, we all make up an electorate. We all make up the constituency for people like Bas and all the other members in this parliament. Unless there is support for the Jewish state out on the streets of Europe, the political leaders cannot stand strong with Israel. And so that's why I believe it's a combination of activating, mobilizing, empowering those who have an inclination to stand with the Jewish people. I think it's still the silent majority. What we see at ULB and other universities is a very loud minority. They're very articulate, they're very sophisticated in their means of communication, but we need to speak to the silent majority of decent people in Europe who do not want to see a repeat of what happened once on European soil, who want to stand up and react in time. And we need to train them, we need to go out there at the universities, in media, we need to meet them one-on-one in all the member states, and then bring this message to this parliament, to national parliaments, to governments, and say, listen, there is a people out there who have learned from the past mistakes and who want to be different. And I think once you get to that very core issue of European identity, there's really no one who will disagree and say, no, we don't want to be different from the 30s and the 40s. But they need to be reminded about it, and people like Bas and other friends here, we need to strengthen their arms, we need to pray for them, we need to support them every way we can. And this way I do think we can make a difference.
Yeah. And how can we support you? I mean, how can Christian viewers across Europe and Holland in particular support you as a Christian member of the European Parliament in standing with Israel and the Jewish people?
Oh, I feel strongly. I feel strongly, surely, in the churches and also by the Christian for Israel movement. They do a lot of good work. But we should not be intimidated here. In the Parliament, to start with, correct, yes. And to have to ask the Lord to give us the courage to say what is on our mind, on protecting the truth, protecting the truth, and also the right cause of the state of Israel, and also the lives here and of our Jewish citizens. But I think also we should. The Jews are so eloquent and they have their own voice. I give you a practical example. We had here a Knesset delegation it was in November. With my dear co-chair Nachman Shai from Kadima, now a government party also. And we decided we are having here our political debate, but we should also go outside. A year ago we visited the Great Synagogue of Brussels and spoke with the Jewish community about their situation. And Professor Kliner also came to our delegation and gives them a voice. Normalization, of course, we are hosting them, we are in line with them. The Knesset delegation went along with me to the beautiful city of Middelburg. There is a nice synagogue. He was restored by Jewish community and the Christian community. They did it together. And then was important, the Knesset delegation came to the university, Roosevelt Academy, a full audience, and they spoke about the position, the situation of Israel amongst now the Arab Spring, and there was a marvelous meeting.
I very much want to thank you for watching. Here we have to mobilise Christian public opinion throughout Europe to stand with Israel and the Jewish people in order to counter the rise of anti-Semitism. So we just want to thank you for watching today's programme.